capacity, tank manufacturers, and that's your kind of bottleneck. Your, your, the main bottleneck to growth is just adding more tanks. Yeah, at some point you have to add a bigger bottling line or some other pieces of equipment. And you know, those, it used to be 5 years ago, it would take you like 3 months to get a tank. And now it takes you like, best case scenario, 6 months, real case scenario, more like 9 months to add a stainless steel tank to ferment your beer in. So, but what you also have going on is overall beer consumption in the U.S. is declining. It's flat to declining. So what does that mean? That means that the big guys that have had this franchise and monopoly for so long, they have capacity, and they're not going to sit idly by and let that go unused. So I would expect more what we like to refer to as faux craft brands to show up in the marketplace. I think you're probably going to start seeing, unfortunately, some price pressure, either from those faux breweries, or you have a whole lot of craft breweries that in the froth of all this growth have committed to major plant expansions, you know, on the magnitude of 10, 20, $30 million. And, you know, unfortunately, one of those temptations you can get led into when you're not making your numbers and you're not paying your nut is you say, well, let's just go out and sell more beer. And 9 times out of 10, that's associated with discounting and price cuts. So, you know, that's from the business side. From the product side, you know, I see, again, I think it looks really good for consumers in terms of the bar has gone up since I've been in the industry in terms of overall quality. Like Kevin said, there's the worst case scenario now is kind of mediocre, but it's rare that you actually encounter a bad bottle of craft beer. And you're definitely going to see more experimentation. I think you know, there's flavor combinations and beer styles out there that we can't even dream of at the moment, that 5 years from now we'll be like, God, why didn't we think of that?
I think from my side of the business, the biggest potential stumbling block is as everybody starts to jump on the craft beer bandwagon, you're going to get a lot of operators that don't really understand the product or trying to sell the product. And in my point of view, the most critical moment in what we do is the opportunity when somebody comes in my bar and says, I normally drink Budweiser. And that's the most critical moment for me, because that's telling me that this person normally drinks this other product, but for some reason, whatever the conditions are, they're in my bar at this moment, and they're willing, by their sheer presence in the bar, they're willing to try something different. And the way you handle that interaction is going to be critical as to whether or not you've converted that person over to the product or you don't. As Eric was saying, craft beer sales are not growing. So we're trying to grow a market inside of a market that's not increasing. And so we're going to be attempting to take consumers away from other areas of the market. And so transitioning consumers is the most important thing for long-term market growth. I think one of the most important things that's happened in the last few years to allow us to do this was the takeover of Anheuser-Busch by InBev, and that now that they're controlled by a different group of individuals that's more focused on P&Ls and spreadsheets and things like that, and less focused about the personal nature of it. There's an opportunity for us to drive a wedge. This was 30 years ago, and Augie Busch was still in charge of AB. He was ruthless about killing competitions. There's this unique opportunity that the huge powerhouses that used to be very personally involved in this business are no longer there. And so you've got this giant that is kind of sleeping right now. So when those people come in, it's really important you know how to transition them. So the most dangerous thing is that if people on my side of the business that don't know what they're doing get into the business, if they mishandle those first introductions with the guest, and that person has a bad craft beer experience, whether it's skanked lines, that you're pouring a beer that's amazing beer, but it tastes like crap because it's gone through a bad system, that's a bad experience. Whether they walk into a craft beer bar that is so craft beer pretentious and like unattainable that consumer's like, I don't want to drink craft beer, those people are assholes, you know. there's all kinds of different things you can do to mess up that first relationship, and that's what scares me the most. Because I mean, Haymark's big and it's busy, and we're doing really well, and that's really great. But I'm never gonna be like the one place that people get their first craft beer experience. They're gonna go everywhere else. And so as more and more retailers get involved with it, it's really important that they have at least some level of understanding that first relationship is so very important, and you have to handle it really well. So I'm kind of scared about those types of people getting into the business and kind of ruining those opportunities. But beyond that, I think a lot of the other threats are going to come, or potential stumbling blocks are going to come from the production distribution side. It's interesting as the craft beer market expands, there's going to have to be some level of contraction at some point in time, and I think that we might see a migration to the ends of the production scale. So I think that in the next 5 years, you're going to see a lot of breweries that are smaller, like less than 10,000 barrels a year, and a lot of breweries that go through massive expansion and push themselves up above 300,000 barrels a year. And I think it's going to be really difficult for breweries that find themselves in that middle, that they're too big to be small and efficient, but they're not large enough to take hold of all the potential efficiencies of being large. And so what might end up happening is you'll end up with these middle-sized breweries that they just get walloped on both sides, and there might be some contraction in the market because of that kind of stuff. But on the same note, one of the biggest things that's led to the growth of craft beer has been the more readily available equipment. So if breweries start to close down, there might be more equipment on the market to be bought secondhand. I mean, there's all kinds of different potential things.
Yeah, just kind of a follow-up to that, and to something you, last topic about if you guys want to open a brewery, if you're crazy enough to want to do that. Yeah, set your business model up to either sort of be really small or really big. And I think small is a good play because you can always, build a business model, get it cash flowing, go out and finance that growth. Whereas, if you go out and get a bunch of investors and say, I want to, take on Karbach and St. Arnold's, and I'm going to build a big old plant, and that carries with it a lot more risk. And I don't know if the reward is there in terms of the industry is growing. It's nowhere near maturation, but there's a lot of other players ahead of you. I mean, if you build a plant, a bigger brewery plant, you're sort of committing to probably being a multi-state operation in terms of your distribution footprint, and that just carries with it a whole a set of challenges, issues, and cost areas. I hate to say this, but I probably wouldn't open a brewery, a small brewery in Texas under the current legal structure. Back to this law thing. Colorado, where I'm from, part of the reason there's so many breweries there right now is the laws are so flexible. You can open with a brew pub license, you can actually sell up to 60,000 barrels of beer to other accounts. You can distribute that beer yourself. You can operate an on-premise establishment, and you can sell beer to go. Texas, all I can do as a microbrewer is have a tour that you pay a tour fee for, and you get some samples while you're on the tour. You're not buying the beer, you're buying the tour. And and that's it. And if a brew pub, I think the laws are even more restrictive. So if you're seriously thinking about, and I don't know, do they have a lot of background on the 3-tier system? I've heard you mention that. You guys, you got
at least 80% would.
Yeah, so we're the manufacturer, the distributor, and then Kevin's the retailer. So my advice would be go to a state where you can straddle at least 2 of the tiers. So where you can actually operate either maybe as a brewer and a distributor. And we can do that in Texas, and that was really important to our initial success, that we were our own distributor. But there's some states where you can't even do that. But set up a business model that makes sense, isn't too big, and if you can operate in 2 of those tiers, just allows you a little more opportunity to have a different profit center on your business. More importantly, it allows you to control the message. I mean, that was so valuable to us being our own distributor to start, is rather than having a third-party distributor out there saying, well, gee, here's what Karbach beer is all about, here's what the history is about. We were having those conversations directly with the retailers, the staff, and in some cases the customers at that establishment.
Yeah, I think that, just to touch on that real quick, I think it should go without saying, but, and the only reason I bring this up is I've seen big companies not do this. You need, if you're gonna open anything in Texas, you need to understand the laws. You need to understand exactly what you are legally able to do. I mean, almost all the time I see people that do stuff, I'm like, you can't do that. I'm like, what do you mean you can't do that? And here comes TABC, see, there you go, you can't do that. BJ's Brewhouse, for example, their business model was to come into a market and build a restaurant brewery, a restaurant brew pub. And then that brew pub would produce beer and supply its satellite brew pub locations all around it. And so they did that. They came into Texas, they opened up the Clear Lake location, you know, I think it's like a 5 or 7 barrel system, and they were cranking out beer, and then they go to open up their second location, I think it was one on the north side, and only then, when they were 2 locations into it, did they realize that they could not legally do that. They could not be a brew pub and distribute their product off-site. This is not a huge company, it was a fairly major company. They had like 35 locations nationally at that point in time. I mean, giant mistake. And so that really hurt them financially. I was with that company at the time. It was an interesting time to watch that happen. So if you're going to do this, learn the law and understand what you can and cannot do, because you'll be surprised at things you can't do.
Before we open it up to Q&A session, is there any last thoughts, pearls of wisdom you'd like to share with students?
Yeah, just, I mean, knowledge, educate yourself, like Kevin said. There's like there's a Cicerone program, you guys may have heard of that, where you can actually become a certified Cicerone, and that's essentially the equivalent of a beer sommelier. And you can do a lot of the work online, and then you take a test, and there's a real basic one they call the certified beer server, which I think is kind of, you know, if you're gonna develop a craft beer program with whatever food and beverage operation you're associated with, I think that staff education piece is so critical. And I think, you know, you can have words on a piece of paper and people can memorize those words, but unless they kind of get a broader understanding of what beer is about and what hops do, and, you know, what malts do and what yeast does, and some of the basics of the process, you have that potential for the customer to come in and kind of be disappointed, because inevitably the server, if they don't have that understanding, is going to misquote something, and the customer's going to go, oh gosh, this isn't what I expected. So, yeah, and if you're thinking of opening your own gig, you know, like I say, just associate yourself with good people around you. Make sure you got a good legal team and accounting team, and I don't think you have to have a business degree to start, but at least know a couple people who do.
Or at least be willing to make some mistakes, and kind of, at least as best you can, factor in some cushion in your budget, because you're going to make mistakes that's going to cost you some money. Which is fine. I mean, I don't disagree. I wouldn't go get one now, and I think I got a better education doing what I did than getting a business degree, but I wasted some money. The most important thing besides the education is that this business is 100% about relationships. From my side, I'm dealing with relationships on both sides. It's about maintaining my relationships with guys like Eric and distributors, and it's about maintaining my relationships with my guests. So it's all about relationship management. And it's not just about, you know, knowing, you know, Eric, like, who's the head brewer and this and that. It's about knowing the guy that drives a forklift at his brewery, or the guy that drives a forklift at the warehouse by the distributor. It's just knowing people, because you'll have no idea what kind of information you get from people every now and then. It's, you know, it's really, really important. And then, you know, knowing your guest, knowing your product. It's all about maintaining relationships. It's probably the most important thing on my side of the business.
Excellent. Do we have any questions from the panel? Start right here.
What are craft brewers doing to get some of the regulations changed in Texas, and what can we do to help?
So, you know, the craft breweries we have, we all belong, or most of us belong to the Texas Craft Brewers Guild. And so we are in the process of trying to, you know, come up with some legislation that can be sponsored in the next legislative session, that, you know, everybody can kind of get behind. And we're a good chunk of the way there. You know, 2 years ago, we thought we were there to where craft breweries were gonna be able to sell beer to go, after a tour or at any point in a tour. So, I definitely, there will be some legislation forthcoming. You know, I know there's a consumer, kind of advocacy group called Open the Taps, and, you may wanna find out about them and figure out how you can support what they're gonna be doing. I think they're kind of waiting for the, craft brewers they're waiting to see what legislation is gonna, be forthcoming before they sort of decide how to mobilize and get the word out. But, yeah, just be vocal about it, when that time comes, which will probably be in the spring, so.
Background.
I was wondering, are there any lobbyists, for the craft brewery industry to get laws changed passed?
Yeah, most of the Texas Craft Brewers Guild, we actually just hired an executive director, and, I'm not, intimately sure whether, he's gonna be acting as a lobbyist or whether, you know, we might hire a lobbyist. I know in a lot of states that have bigger guilds and where a lot of craft breweries exist and a lot of craft beer is produced, they actually do hire, lobbyists. You know, it's just one of those unfortunate, rules of the game these days in the legislative process, but, there is a precedent for that for sure.
I know this could be a production issue, but you know that a lot of, at least regulars at the bar I used to work at, would go to GABF and bring back or send back illegally, beers that you couldn't get in Texas. Do you think because of the growing demand for craft beer in this state and the lawsuit that Jester King sued TABC for last year, do you think breweries such as Goose Island or Southern Tier or even Founders will see that there is a market in Texas and come into the state?
Goose Island's coming into the state. They'll be here.
Imminently.
Yeah, like 2 months from now. Southern Tier is contracted to come in the state. Their production is being eaten up by their contracts with Dogfish Head right now. So they're not gonna come to the state anytime soon until they get the production set up. I don't know necessarily about Founders, but yeah, I mean, the demand in the state is what's driven the increase in the product availability. I know that there's breweries that looked at this state like 5 years ago and decided not to come in, and then have recently entered the market because the demand was so high. And like the breweries that have been here for a while, they're increasing their allocations to Texas. Stone's a good example of that. You know, 5 years ago, the entire state of Texas was selling as much Stone as the city of San Diego was selling. And now that the consumption of that product has increased, we're getting more products from them, greater allocations of those products, stuff like that. So, and then the Jester King lawsuit, it remains to be seen what's gonna like really flush out as far as the way TBC changes their laws in regards to that. But those type of activities are just kind of demonstrating to out-of-state craft breweries that, hey, there's a market in Texas, and hey, we are willing to grow that market if the product comes out.
I just have another follow-up question. I'm not sure if they've come back, but you know how Allagash pulled their product from Texas? Do you think they'll ever come back, or it's because I know it's a production issue that they couldn't
Well,
get to their.
and at that time, there was a lot of breweries that were pulling, and not just from Texas, but just a lot of there's like production capacity. There's a lot of these smaller breweries that had started out smaller locally, had increased tank space, weren't moving as much beer as they wanted to, so they started selling out of state. Well, and as their home markets grew, they began to have problems supplying their satellite states, so they pulled. We almost lost Avery at the same time too. I think that if their production levels increase, then they'll come back, you know, and if they continue to be able to sell all of their product in their home market, there's not a lot of incentive to come back. So.
Yeah, I think the question there is, it all kind of ties back to this, you know, distributor portfolio, retailer shelf allocation. I mean, you come out of the market for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and you could end up having a lot of backfill from other Texas breweries that, you know, Allagash, they great wheat beer and a lot of really interesting single bottle stuff. Well, you've got a lot of Texas breweries that are starting to make those type of substitute products. So, you know, that's just a business decision that they're gonna have to entertain. But yeah, certainly I think that the most friendly thing they could do is restructure the labeling laws and the licensing fee structure. I think it would be great if they could, you know, I'm a huge believer in, when it comes to taxation, just everything pro rata. I love value added. I love that, how they do that in Europe, you know, drive everything towards sales tax. So breweries, instead of having to pay this big flat fee to be able to sell beer in Texas, there's some way they could make it to where, hey, this is how much beer you sold here last year, and you're gonna pay the same proportionate amount that, you know, Anheuser-Busch does. And that would be level the playing field a little bit, I think.
I have a question for you, Eric. You mentioned earlier that the craft beer industry is going towards like the wine industry, where there's so much selection that it's almost overwhelming. And if you see it going to that point here in the U.S., do you think it's important to produce a beer that's affordable and that can be sold in bigger quantities, but still match the quality of the beer that you currently produce? And if you do, is there anything being done as far as research and development towards a more affordable, maybe not a mass market beer, but a more affordable beer that could become something like, you know, not the Keystone, but like the case beer that you buy in the store?
I think the wine industry, if you study that, offers a lot of interesting parallels. Gallo, I think, is the one company that's kind of nailed it, because they've successfully been able to position their brands you've drunk that you paid $20+ at retail a bottle for, that you thought were fantastic, and you don't even know it's Gallo. Yet they still have the lower price, you know, end of the market wrapped up, and they do a fantastic job of that. Blue Moon has kind of done a pretty good job of that. I mean, how many of you guys know who makes Blue Moon?
Coors.
So a few. Most of you did not know that Coors makes Blue Moon, right? Yeah, okay, I'm seeing, right? Everybody did? So, now does that matter to you? Now that you know that, does that matter to you? No, because the beer tastes good. You're like, hey, this is, so I think, you know, Coors, and they have a couple of, Miller Coors has a couple of craft beer divisions that they're developing. So I think they kind of get it, and they're going to attack that. By and large, craft brewers are still growing, and they're growing their existing franchise, so they don't necessarily have to be looking so hard at those diversification issues. I think they're sort of saying, you look at New Belgium, they're sort of a good example. I mean, Fat Tire is a very accessible brand, still priced at a pretty good price point, but then they're sort of going up from there in terms of their product offerings. They're not necessarily dumbing it down. You know, there have been a lot of input, just like with the restaurant industry, there have been a lot of input cost increases to beer over the last 5 years. And so, yeah, I would say Fat Tire is a pretty profitable item for them, but for them to all of a sudden say, we're gonna come up with a $5.99 6-pack of something, you know, that's gonna certainly, you know, pinch their margins pretty significantly, and you know, I just think from a business strategy standpoint, once you get into that game, all of a sudden you're taking off the gloves and you're going up against some much bigger players with bigger war chests. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Well, yeah, and then the other thing was, is there anything that you can do? Do people look into matching the quality of a Fat Tire, the flavor, and the quality of, you know, the ingredients that can be attained at a cheaper price to just the quality, matching a quality at being able, is it able to be sold at a price that's cheaper than the $9, $10 a six pack?
Probably, yeah, probably, but, you know, it's just like, at the pump. I mean, once those prices go up, you know, unless the market just collapses, the folks that are in it, they're not gonna give away that margin. So, yeah, I think beers that are, you know, $7.99 to $8.99 that don't have a lot of hops in them and are only 5% alcohol by volume. Personally, knowing what goes into beer, that's extending the value proposition probably beyond what I think a fair price is. You know, conversely, I think there's some craft beers that are out there for $9.99 a six pack, where I know how much they dry hop these beers and some of the processes they go through, and it's like, geez, they should be getting 12 or 13 bucks a six pack for that. So that's the beauty of business, man. Is the marketing aspect is sort of the you know, angle that you can command a higher price point if you're doing that right.
What do you feel is the importance of a barrel aging program as it relates to like a brewery's reputation and popularity, not just right here, but nationally?
Fantastic question. Something we're obviously getting into ourselves, and I think it kind of goes back to this gentleman's question too. Is I think breweries, you know, you've got a couple paths. You can either sort of carve out a niche, or you know, yeah, having a broader portfolio where barrel-aged beers are part of that is important. We've kind of chosen that latter strategy. You know, we've got our core six packs. We have our 22-ounce kind of medium-priced bottles, like the Crunkin' Pumpkin we just came out with, our You'll Shoot Your Eye Out, which is coming out in a couple weeks. And then we have our really high-end barrel-aged stuff. I think you can carve, there's a model to carve out at the high end, but I don't think just saying, I think the days of somebody just saying, hey, I just want to make six packs and six packs only, you're right. I don't think it gives your brewery a lot of credibility. So it almost is like a price of entry anymore that you have to do. If you're not doing barrel-aged beers, you at least have to do some really high alcohol, high hop, unique flavor, something. And it's one of those, but it's okay for craft brewers because even though, you know, we're charging a definite premium for that, and we have much higher input costs, you know, we're making okay money at those, so we're okay doing it. The guys that are sort of establishing a niche for doing only that, I don't know, jury's still out on that a little bit for me, because again, you can have this national footprint distribution-wise, but you know, in your local market, there's gonna be a couple guys that are gonna be doing their own barrel-aged beers. So unless that national beer is just super, super fantastic, I think they're gonna get lost in the shuffle, and local's always gonna win. Do you have any follow-up thoughts
No,
on
I mean, I think that those type of, like, those kind of extreme, I mean, I'm just gonna use the words like extreme beers, not, and just to kind of describe it, that stuff is almost a necessity, just as a flagpole for a brewery, just to kind of run it up and say, here's who I am. And on my side as a retailer, it's required, A, I like that stuff a whole hell of a lot, so I buy as much as I can, but B, it's required that I have that stuff to, you know, be able to show off, you know, the types of beers that I sell. I do not, as much as I would love to have 80 badass, like, extreme beers on tap all the time, I'm not gonna make money on that, because I'm gonna price those beers at a much, much higher cost of goods sold per ounce than I would something lighter. And it's just, for me to have that product, I'm willing to pay that premium and not make as much money on it, because it's just, I'm putting it out there, I'm giving it to the consumer. And I also kind of think of it as like, you know, that's kind of my gift to the people who ask questions like that. Like, if you understand enough about it to be able to ask a question like that, I'm gonna try to give that beer to you at the best possible price that I can afford, because, you get it. And I want you to be able to enjoy that kind of stuff. But I think that stuff's important.
It's like steak. You know, you don't make money on steak in a percentage terms, but when you charge $30 for a cut of meat, you're making dollar-wise, you're maybe making a little bit more than you would at the, you know, $11.99 pasta puttanesca. So,
No,
it's the
it's
same
true.
concept, you know, I'm probably winning pretty good at that game. I'm probably, me and the distributor always wins. I wish Ash was here, because that, I tell you what, and to his point, if you wanna get into this business and make some money, become a distributor.
You need millions and millions of dollars.
You do. It's, you know, you can't bootstrap a successful distributorship, but, Kevin's right, you know, by the time it gets marked up to him, he's gonna weed out a lot of pints or a lot of servings, because people are just gonna say, it's like Macallan, 18 or 25. Sure, man, I just got a frickin', you know, Christmas bonus check. It's party, but you're not gonna do that day in and day out.
And my pricing is different. I mean, I make a lot of money off certain beers, and I sell those beers so I can afford to sell other beers. It's just like the name of the game.
One more question. With the Anheuser-Busch's takeover of Goose Island, like you as being as a supporter of small craft breweries and a craft beer advocate, do you think you're gonna be able to? Are you gonna personally be selling an Anheuser-Busch product in your bar, or?
That's a really excellent question, and I haven't really come to terms with that personally as to what I'm gonna do. Part of me wants to say no. Part of me wants to say, I'm not gonna sell that product, you know, blah, blah, because I've kind of, like within this market, I've kind of established myself as like that guy, that I'm like, you know, the crusader for craft beer, blah, blah, blah. The other part of me is, it's really freaking good beer, you know, so, like my own philosophical point of view is kind of torn between like protecting and doing my part to help establish small independent guys like myself that have really put themselves out there, and also selling really, really good product. My decision is going to be based, at this point in time, I've got to pick something to be able to make my decision for me. So my personal decision about that is going to be based upon what products come to the market when they first launch.
And maybe what brewery they came out of.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is which brewery they came out of. Are they coming out of the Goose Island Brewery, you know, or are they coming out of another Anheuser brewery? That's a huge one. Now, being able to answer that question is going to be very difficult, because you've got to be able to understand enough about the way to read a product to know where that brewery came from. If they launch in this market with just their entry level stuff, and it's brewed at one of their satellite breweries, probably not. If they launch in this market like they should, then yeah. But it's hard to, I mean, it's really a great question, because I've gone back and forth with my staff, and I've talked about it. We don't really know what we're gonna do yet. So.
I think we have time for one more question.
Kevin, you talked about when somebody comes in at Game Merchant and they've drank Budweiser their whole life. What kind of policy or what kind of formula do you use to figure out where to start them in craft beer? Is there a certain beer or group of beers that you want to start them with before you give them something more than they can handle?
Yeah, definitely. Budweiser is an American premium lager. The American premium lager formula was developed to emulate the Bohemian-style Czech Pilsners that were coming into this market in the late 19th century. So that's a really great place to start, if you're going to start with something that is similar to that product. I have beers that I specifically carry as the Anheuser Response beer. And they're things that, from a palate perspective, are approachable for that drinker, but from a brand, they are something unique and interesting, so that I can not blow them away with like a palate experience that's going to scare them off, but I can give them a unique experience they can go home and tell their friends about, and feel like they really came away with something positive. So I've got, and trying to find those beers were actually probably the hardest thing for me to do when we opened, because I can buy all kinds of crazy extreme beers, but to try to find those 4 or 5 response beers that were still legitimate craft, that